And we're live. Take it away, Mariana.
Great. So thank you for joining us for today's webinar focused on radical self-care as a necessary movement building strategy. I'm Mariana Islam. I am the Director of Programs and Advocacy at the Schott Foundation, and I'll be your moderator for this discussion. The Schott Foundation is an education justice fund working to build a movement for equity and opportunity in public education. We're also home to the National Opportunity to Learn Network, comprised of students, educators, parents, advocates, civil rights groups, and researchers, many of you working to ensure systemic change. Some of you may be thinking, why is a national philanthropic organization thinking about self-care a day after a national address, and especially when what we have to do is roll up our sleeves and get to work, and especially in a moment when marginalized communities are becoming the accelerated targets of very harmful agendas that will further perpetuate the very inequities we are working to address? Well, that is all true, but we know much is of the heart, soul, and spirit in this work, and we know we can't be effective without ensuring the health, wellness, and vibrancy of our people. So often, especially in marginalized communities, that work to show up relentlessly is taken for granted and remains a hidden and undervalued labor. Well, not today. We wanted to create space to talk about why we need to prioritize self-care in our movement building work. We want to share our stories. We want to share indigenous and inventive tools and strategies so you're not feeling alone or isolated in what is, has been, and will continue to be a collective struggle. I can think of no other conversation I would rather have today than this one with this group of people. And I'm delighted to be joined by Akaya Winwood, President of Rockwood Leadership Institute, Carlos Rojas Alvarez, Special Projects Consultant at Youth on Board, and Dr. Saida Pinto, Director of Leadership Education at the Wildecrest Leadership Initiative in North Carolina. To help facilitate your engagement, we ask you to please post your questions and comments in the chat box or tweet them to us and help us create visibility around this important labor and conversation. You can use the Twitter handle @SchottFound, @SCHOTTFOUND, using the hashtag GrassrootsEd. We will reserve the last 15 to 20 minutes to respond to your questions. So at this time, I'd like to pass the mic to our esteemed group of speakers to share a little bit about their background and how they came to this conversation about self-care as a necessary movement building strategy. We'll start with Akaya.
Well, thank you for inviting me to this conversation. It's an important conversation, particularly in these times. At Rockwood, you call it self-care, a lot of people do. We call it personal ecology. And the idea is that it's important to maintain balance, pacing, efficiency, so that we are available for a lifetime of service and activism work. And so it's in service of this larger agenda, which is social transformation. So the importance, taking care of ourselves is crucial. It's not an extra. There was a time not so long ago where people thought, oh, isn't that self-indulgent? That's what those people do. And I don't have to name who those people are, but those with power or privilege. It's a privileged thing. And over time, we've come to understand that the cost of burnout, exhaustion, bitterness, all of that is the costs are high, particularly on our social movements. So this is not, we don't see this as a self-indulgent thing at all. We see this as a community, as community medicine, right? So that if I care for myself and get enough rest, get enough, eat well, exercise, it's not about me taking care of me. It's about me having the resources to take care of us, right? So this is inherently relational. It is, I think, part of an integral part of any political struggle or strategy is needs to be taking care of ourselves and supporting each other in doing that, not denigrating each other or cutting each other down because somebody needs to take a rest. So to me, this is very essential. If we're going to really make social change, it's going to require a long-term perspective. So caring for ourselves so that we can work in the long haul or over the long term is crucial.
Great. Maria, Carlos?
Thanks, Mariana. I'm really excited to be on this webinar representing Youth on Board and sharing my personal journey with what self-care and healing look like or can look like in movement building. But I want to say a little bit about myself. I was born in Colombia, and when I was 5, I moved to Boston with my mother to seek a better life. And 6 months out from arriving in this country, we became undocumented. So I'm one of about 2 million undocumented young people that were brought to this country as children and have known this country more than any other country as home. And I also grew up working class. I grew up with family members and parents that oftentimes worked 2 to 3 jobs to survive, not thrive. And so I bring to my work in movement building not only a unique and important perspective in reshaping the world, but I also bring with me particular traumas that I internalized from heavy oppression as I grew up. I joined Youth on Board, a youth program in Boston that administers the Boston Student Advisory Council, BSAC, my sophomore year of high school. And I entered a space not only where young people could have a voice in what they wanted to work on, the solutions that they wanted to implement, but I came into a space that was radically centered on the personal liberation of young people in that space. A space that recognized that young people, particularly young people of color, organizing against big oppressions in public education and racial injustice and economic injustice, cannot organize, cannot be asked to go up against these oppressions without intentional, communal, and consistent social emotional healing and support. So I'm excited to be talking about our what we call our action and support model, how we have used it over the past 24 years, and our Listening Works project, which we launched as a response to the election last November and the current political climate.
Great, looking forward to hearing more about that. I'll turn it over to Saida to introduce a little bit about yourself and how you're coming to this conversation today.
Mariana, thank you for including me. I always love doing things with you. And I just want to say that from my perspective, I don't necessarily come at this from the perspective of self-care. There are duties and responsibilities I have to a community that has loved me well and that has surrounded me with all kinds of abundance. And so every day of my life, I try to work very hard to honor what's been given. And I try very hard to make real the kind of promise and the practices of love that actually lead us to personal and collective. And so I'm here because I'm part of that kind of community.
Thank you, Saida. So my first question is for Akaya. As you mentioned, you're in the leadership capacity building space. Can you talk about how Rockwood thinks about self-care as an important aspect of individual leadership and social change, and especially in this moment? You talked a little bit about it in your introduction, but I'm hoping you can get a little bit deeper.
Yeah, so many leaders. So we sit in the intersections of social change, Rockwood does. And, there are very few social movements who don't show up somehow or other, that we don't touch or touch us. It's been heartbreaking to see how many of our folks who are obviously struggling against incredible odds, trying to right just egregious wrongs, and how many folks are literally burned out and who are raggedy. We're not resilient. We are often taking this lack of resilience out on one another. And Rockwood actually started back in 2000 as a response to some of this, because we saw, I wasn't here then, but they saw what happens when leaders bite on each other and tear each other down, and often because they just don't have the emotional or physical resources to respond well. And at that time, it was oh, this is just cultish self-indulgence. Everybody's going to take a spa day, and people made a lot of fun of it. But over time, it's really I think there's been a dawning awareness of the importance of this, especially in this political moment. Now, let's be real. Our communities have been struggling forever. This is not a special time, but I think that this last year has been remarkably hard on folks, because it's as if every possible way of being hateful is happening all at once, which is overwhelming. And people are getting sick. They're dropping away. I'm watching some bitterness take over our movements. And so, I care deeply about this. I come from people who have struggled mightily for generations. And each generation hopes that this will be the last generation that has to struggle in this way. And I certainly hope that I'm the last generation. I doubt it, but my hope is that. And so this notion of caring for self, and I really want to appreciate Saida, because it isn't even this language called self-care puts it in a context that I don't think speaks to the importance of it. This really is about understanding ourselves in relation to the earth, in relation to the community, we're in relatedness. And so if we aren't exquisitely caring for all of it, of which we are an integral part, each of us, then what we do is replicate the current dynamic, which is, extraction, oppression, all of the things that we're working against. So I'll leave that there.
Thank you. So now my next question is for Carlos. So Carlos, you are coming to this conversation as a longtime organizer, right? And you've talked about how spaces for organizing, especially centering the voices and leadership of marginalized folks, people of color, undocumented, etc. Can you talk about your work uplifting self-care as part of a collective organizing strategy?
Absolutely. I think that the word self-care is misleading, because for us, healing and collective liberation is so communal. There is no other way to do this. As human beings, we are inherently connected, inherently wanting companionship, inherently seeking community. And self-care, in the way that it's been reimagined by certain people, spa day, yoga, get yourself to the gym, eat right, I think is misleading. And of course, that can play a role in healing and in healthy lifestyles, but it's not the end all be all. And in fact, to us, it's not the most important part. So at Youth on Board, we start with the belief that all people are good inherently, that we are born good, loving, capable of caring for other people, but human beings get hurt. We all get hurt. We get hurt by systemic oppression. We get hurt by interpersonal experiences. Now, this applies to everyone. That includes me as an undocumented young person of color who grew up working class. This includes various other oppressed communities. And this also includes oppressors. This is a deeply hurtful society that hurts people who are trained to carry out oppression. So we get hurt. And the good news is that we can heal, that we do have the ability to heal from the trauma that we carry from our experiences. So at Youth on Board, we're very invested in making sure that that healing happens communally, it happens intentionally and regularly, and that it happens in the long term. A few years ago, we noticed that when young people were coming into our program in Boston, we were asking them to go up against the school to prison pipeline, dropouts, factors, racist administrators, lack of funding and equity in their schools. But without healing, young people were coming into the program carrying a lot of baggage, and they were turning on each other, were fighting each other, were fighting the staff members, were finding any opportunity to express how hurt, how disappointed, how let down, how pissed off they were. And we said, we've got to create intentional spaces for those feelings to come out. So for us, emotion is a great thing, even though it's scary to most people out in the world. But for us, emotion is something to be processed, to be cared about, and most importantly, to be listened to. So our model is actually quite simple, and it's actually quite inherent to human beings, which is that when you're actually being listened to thoughtfully and lovingly and are being given a space to express how you're feeling and how it's impacting you, healing happens. And healing can look like many things, from venting to crying, to laughing your ass off, to shaking if you're scared, to raging. These are the kinds of things that we lean in on. We don't shy away from them. We lean in and we create safe spaces for people to be able to process those feelings. And to no one's surprise on this webinar, what happens when you provide people enough space to do that is that they are more able to be connected to each other, to remember how good they are and how other people are. We're more effective. We can tell the difference between what's happening right now in the present versus what happened to us a long time ago. And we're just better organizers and movement builders. So that's really what we're hoping to spread and to sort of engage people on, is how do we institutionalize these spaces and practices that allow us to be more effective.
Great, and I'll have some follow-up questions about tools and strategies in order to do that. So my next question is for Saida. So like Akaya, you are also in the leadership capacity building space, and also, if I may say, leading important healing justice work as well. And so in this toxic political climate where we may have all deleted some folks on Facebook and, you know, are pretty polarized, what are some key leadership challenges that we need to overcome to approach our work differently in the way that Carlos and Akaya both discuss? How do we do that with more intention and care for people, especially marginalized folks?
So I always, my eyebrow goes a little bit when I hear about how different the environment is right now from the past. For me, it's not particularly different. As somebody who stands outside of a whole bunch of different kinds of established movement structures and organizational structures and social movements, the landscape has always been hostile, and it's always been filled with rejection. It's also been filled with the efforts to normalize practice, or to make things predictable and standardized behavior within organizations as part of efforts to institutionalize strategies and approaches. And having grown up in Boston, and having done most of my work in New England, there's instances where I can point to where, great. And then institutionalization processes come online. And next thing you know, you lose the heart and the intention of the entire initiative. And so I'm watching an emergent conversation about spirituality and around indigeneity and around decolonization. And I'm watching similar patterns of behavior where the thing that you most crave or you're trying to create becomes an object to institutionalize and then to somehow normalize within the life of organizations. And what I know is that some things cannot be normalized and institutionalized, and that's okay. One of the things that can't be normalized and institutionalized is our relationship to the sacred, our relationship to our, to the folks and the interests and the passions that make us even want to step up in so much investment in becoming kind of like a peg in the wheel. And so I struggle around some of the language and some of the intention to institutionalize something like decolonization processes or the expression of indigeneity or the way that we connect to the sacred. Challenges that I see in terms of leadership have to do with two things. Really, actually, having our external behavior spring forth from an interior condition of well-being and abundance. And how many times we justify and are forced to make decisions and act out organizational lives that might not be in accordance with our interior condition. I've never seen that work and actually bring about transformation. But many of us are telling ourselves that that's okay to do for the interest of something greater. But I really believe that what we do is what we create, and what we create is what we do. There really isn't a difference between how we do and what we're actually creating in the world right now. The other piece that I'm seeing that's concerning is performance. It's, this sense of like, this is how you do X, Y, and Z. So I want to be more healed. So I'm going to do X, Y, and Z to get to that place. Or I'm going to be more relational. And so these are the steps towards relationality. We've seen that problematically in the field of restorative justice around the use of circles, where you now have structured out the entire, containment of the process or the building of the process into this many steps with this much content. And what that does is actually takes out the actual enactment of that which is sacred and the actual enactment of relationship. And so my thoughts in general have to do with making sure that we're accountable to our interior condition, that whatever justifications we have to have disparate lives in the outside of ourselves and the inside of ourselves, that those justifications get worked out. Somebody like me is very adept at telling who's in it for real and who isn't, because of my virtue of the walk that I've had to walk. And I really respond well to leaders who are fully connected from the very depth of their passion and the thing that they hold most sacred in the world and the way they express themselves in the outer world. For me, in my practice, my accountability to my interior condition has to do with sitting and contemplating behavior, contemplating, mindset. Contemplation is very important to me, and contemplation not in the sense of just me sitting around on a cushion trying to meditate, but actually doing it collectively, doing it in movement, and doing it in whatever way I can all the time. Really be paying attention to how I'm showing up in the world. That capacity has to be anchored in a relationship with that which is sacred and total radical acceptance of the things I don't know, the mysteries that are in front of me, that which is not to be defined or structured away or institutionalized. And that requires that I surrender everything that I know, that I think I know, the thing that I think maybe makes me special. I don't know, whether it's my victim story or my story of personal liberation, whatever, that I surrender all that. And I have to sit in the vulnerability of just being this little tiny person in this much larger context of complexity. There's an energetic clarity that comes with that actually allows me to build the community that I most desire and that can actually see me the best. And so that's really where I'm at with all of this.
Thank you for that. So I'm wondering, I'm going to turn this back to Carlos too, having heard Saida talk about sort of her process and in both individual and collective space. I wanted to go back to you and ask you a little bit more about what that looks like in your model.
Absolutely. You know, for us, what we try to do is we try to hold on to the perspective that when we start out in life, we are pretty much equipped with internal tools for processing hurtful things that happen to us. If you've ever been around or have had or watched babies or young children, babies and young children will cry out when they want to be paid attention to. Young children will cry out against injustice, anything that happens that is wrong. I remember I cried a lot as a little boy. I cried when people died in movies. I cried when my mother did something that was adultist and not correct. And almost everyone gets that beaten out of them at some point. The older we get, the less okay it is to show how you're feeling, the less okay it is to protest and say that's wrong, the less okay it is for us to actually rely on people and be connected to them and show them how we're feeling or what's going on. And so we build these shells that get thicker and thicker as we have to endure more and more of a society that doesn't quite make sense. It is not structured around humans. And for us, it's about how do we undo those years of having to shut down that innate human ability to heal and to show and to feel. So for us, it is about creating intentional spaces in our work that allow people to feel and to trust that other people there are caring enough and are able to just listen and listen lovingly and trust them with whatever we're feeling. I remember that the first 2 years of being part of this organization, I wouldn't say a single thing about my feelings. I would show up to a healing circle and I would spend my time talking about homework and talking about just random things. I didn't want to talk about my feelings. I'd been trained very early on to not show how I'm feeling, to keep it inside and to deal with it. And it took 2 whole years for the program director to actually get through that wall. And when she got through that wall, I cried like a baby for about an hour. It must have been about an hour that I just cried and cried and cried. And after I cried, everything was clear. Like everything was just a little bit clear. I could see more clearly. I could think more clearly. I could remember how connected I was to the person that had listened to me cry. And that's when I realized that there was something important and special about the ability to process emotion. And that really is at the heart of action and support. That is what we try to promote, is how do we train people to be able to do the listening work that is required to build safe enough spaces. It is an innate ability that we do lose because of the society that we live in. And so it does take practice. It takes people sort of being dedicated to it and having enough of a chance to practice listening, to practice sharing emotions. And what we find is that we're able to eventually build safe enough spaces that people can actually use that circle or that meeting or that support group as a real resource to work on the things that they are feeling. And we know that when we do that consistently, young people, our organizers, our staff show up to the work more fully, more lovingly, and more capable of tackling the huge things that we're trying to tackle. And I completely, agree with Saito. We're looking at restorative justice expanding really phenomenally quickly in our public schools. The Boston Public Schools just got a very big grant to implement restorative justice practices in schools. And of course, we're extremely excited about that. It is a step in the right direction, but to what degree will a restorative justice circle become a scripted, rote, institutionalized thing that doesn't actually honor the inherent indigeneity and the inherent beauty of a circle? It is about a cultural shift. It's not about follow step 1, 2, and 3, and you've done it. It is about shifting the way that we look at human beings, that we look at hurt and trauma, and that we look at the way community can heal us from those traumas and then end those oppressions. So that's sort of a little bit about where we come from and sort of how we operate within our model.
Great. So I just have a couple more questions, but the questions we're getting from our audience is blowing up right now. So I want to make sure we get to those as well. So just sticking with you, Carlos, for a second, can you talk about your work empowering young people and some of the generational differences and around expectations, vulnerability, right? And how do you navigate that with youth and adults?
It's a great question. I think that's one of the other really challenging things about intergenerational spaces is that there isn't enough space for people to really build trusting relationships with each other and heal from the way that we've all been conditioned to think about young people, right? When we were young, our minds weren't trusted, our leadership wasn't followed, we were diminutized, we were diminished, we weren't listened to for the most part. So that's what we're up against when we're talking about organizing with young people, right? Is that there's a massive oppression that is inherent to being young, in addition to the racism, sexism, classism, environmental degradation that young people are vulnerable to. It's oftentimes a setup to have an organization where there are adult staff, adult support, young adult organizers, alumni organizers working directly with young people. If you don't set up a space for the young adults, the alumni staff, the adult staff to actually be able to consistently work on unpacking the way that adultism, as we call it, has impacted them, we have seen it go wrong time and time again, right? Because we've all internalized that trauma and we're going to act it out on the very young people that we love and care about unintentionally. And that's one of the things we often see as a challenge in building intergenerational spaces. Young people in Boston have done a beautiful job in building intergenerational spaces in the grassroots education movement. BEJA, the Boston Education Justice Alliance, being a really clear example of adults in the form of teachers and parents working with young people for educational justice. And the challenge we often face is where young people bring real trauma and adults bring real trauma and often act it out on each other. And because there is an imbalance of power between adults and young people, we do see that come down on the young people very harshly. I say harshly because it's harsh, but it can look very benign and as implicit as sort of not allowing the young people to talk as much as the adults taking up a lot more space talking than the young people, wondering why the young people won't speak up. Why won't they just talk? All of those are really big signs of the oppression running in the meeting. And unless young people and adults get to have space to heal from the effects of the oppression, get to reflect on what it was like for them to grow up as young people, how adults treated them and how that made them feel, unless young people get the space to rage and be mad about adultism and how it really seriously limits them in their lives and their ability to operate as big and bold and beautiful as we can as young people, it's very hard to build those intergenerational spaces. So healing in the form of getting people to reflect on how these oppressions have affected them is, to me and to us, I think the number one priority when we begin to talk about these spaces.
Thank you. So Akai, I want to turn to you for just a minute because you had talked a little bit about sort of our culture of, or call out culture, right? And so Francis Lee wrote this piece that was circulating all over social media about call out culture and creating a sense of fear in movement spaces. And so without getting into if there's value in calling people out or not, I do want to recognize that sometimes our exhaustion, as you mentioned, comes from having to call someone out or being called out. So in your experience, what are some ways to address this? Sorry, you're on mute still.
You know, I find that compassion is helpful, and I mean that not in a I mean that as an active thing. That what if we could give each other a break? And that is not to say let's just go to sleep or pretend like there's not oppression or people aren't saying certain things right or any of that. But I think there's not enough kindness. And when I use the word kindness, I mean it from its root of kin, right? To be kin with one another and to recognize that we are inextricably connected to one another, to the earth, to all living, all life, right? And so the vitriol and the correctness, if you don't see it my way, then you are suspect, is literally killing us. So I've been very troubled by the way we engage each other. How might we, especially if around some of this stuff around the Me Too, the current Me Too stuff, right? That I'm watching us. So let me come out as Me Too, right? And I'm still asking the question of how do we have a kind of engagement at the community level that allows us not to throw anyone away, that keeps the circle of humanity whole. And I know that a lot of the restorative justice folks are working on that. And like the other speakers, I'm interested in it not being codified and made irrelevant because of the right way to do it. But this, how we call each other together to talk about what's off or awry is, and I want to really underscore what Saida said about the way we do it is as important as what we do. So yeah, I think we need new ways of being kind with one another, even as we hold each other. I don't love the word accountable anymore because it makes it sound like I'm in charge of what you're supposed to do. And I have no interest in that. First of all, I'm too tired to do that. But also, how do we engage each other so that there's more compassion and kindness in our social movement? So I'm very interested in that.
Okay. Saida, do you have anything that you'd want to add to that conversation? I know this comes up a lot in your work. You're on mute still.
Yeah, this comes up all the time, and you know, fundamentally, how we treat ourselves is how we treat each other. And so, if we're working from deficit, whether it's a deficit ideologically, or spiritually, or emotionally, or physically, just because we're so tired we can't pay attention to how we're interacting with other people, fundamentally what we do to ourselves is what we do in the outside world of, if there's such a thing as the outside world. And so the invitation is to step into a place of abundance. And if we're really focused on getting our analysis correct and finding the right way to be, and finding, in some ways, I would say, personal salvation within the not the right direction towards really fully radically accepting each other and ourselves and embracing ourselves and each other from that place. And so I really believe that if I was going to try to write all the oppression that affects me, my life would be a lost case, because I would have to be in meetings every day of my life about one thing or another. And at some point in my life, very early on, thankfully, I decided that it was enough, that I needed to actually figure out what it meant to live in this body and be this person and build a life from that place of total radical love and acceptance for myself. And then the journey from that has been really interesting. You would think that there will be social movements who would be really thrilled to have somebody who's like operating from a place of abundance, but that hasn't been the case, because when you come from a place of deficit, it's very difficult to accept abundance around you, right? If you're not really willing to let that go and surrender that, right? And so that's why that capacity to surrender and to really take off of the things that you have really worked hard to claim and that you have really worked hard to earn, to just take them off, and be in the vulnerability of just a pure humanity. That is a skill, actually, that is really critical, not only for our self-acceptance, but actually to engage others, and then also to innovate. And to me, those things are all part of a creative process that is fueled by that which is not definable, which is our relationship to what's sacred. So.
Okay, so big question. How do we address internalized oppression in this space? I mean, a lot has to do with what we just talked about, right? What we're experiencing, the way things are is leading to what we're experiencing and is leading to how we show up, right? It's all very connected. So how do we begin to address that in this space?
Is that a question you want me to answer? Or?
Yeah, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, there's the way that ideologies replicate themselves is by changing just enough that different folks can accept them. And so the internalized oppression actually is a process of assimilation into the oppressive systems and structures, values, and ways of seeing the world. As an Indigenous person, I had to really grapple with the ways in which cultural genocide happens, and began to understand deficit mindset actually as furthering that agenda of cultural genocide, right? And so that doesn't mean that I don't have stuff that I need to work on, or things come up all the time. I have an actual embodied experience of a huge amount of investment in my annihilation, and I know that the place of my happiness and the place of my sense of well-being is in living in abundant relationship. And so, yeah, it's a lot of work. And then it isn't. Then it's like, how would I choose to live in misery when I know that I can get access to total, complete joy and abundance? And so I choose every day to live in that space. And, my encouragement for other folks that I work with is to try to always come from that place.
So we have a lot of questions coming in about how to get employers and organizations to lift this up more in the work. And so want to see who wants to tackle that question.
I could say a couple of things, Mariana. I often think back to, being undocumented, we've recently taken a project of ours, Listening Works, out into the community. What we have found is that if we do enough internal work in our organization around healing and listening, then we are much better prepared to go out and engage our communities, particularly in the current political climates, engaging communities that are being divided by hate. So, unlike many undocumented people, I am really excited in 2018 to go out into Trump voting communities. And one of the things I've already dealt with as someone who was part of the push to win DACA and to fight for immigration reform in 2012 and 2013 is having people call me illegal to my face. And that was happening at the time that I was really getting into Youth on Board's action and support model. I was having weekly listening partnerships with organizers, which meant that we were sharing time, 15 minutes each. You go first, I go second, you listen to me first, I listen to you, talk about whatever. I was using listening partnerships. I was attending resource support groups for, at Youth on Board, that pertained to me, that I was interested in. Support group for young men of color, support group for gay men. And I was doing all of this healing work. And what I started to realize was that someone calling me illegal to my face wasn't actually hurting me in that moment. I wasn't actually in danger. There was someone across from me that is clearly very hurt, that is trying to use a word that is going to trigger feelings of inadequacy, of being shut out of the society, of having to live in this country in the shadows. Whatever that word triggered in me, it was triggering those feelings. But in the moment, I actually was in control. I could have a conversation with someone and realize that their use of the word illegal was not actually hurting me in that moment. The hurt had happened. The hurt was happening systemically, but that person was not hurting me. And when I realized that, I could actually take control of that conversation. I could realize and operate from a place of recognizing that that person is deeply confused about who I am, my value and my worth. And I could navigate that conversation in a way that was way more effective than if I had allowed the word illegal to derail me. And I say that because, I think that in spaces where we're trying to organize, I'm hoping that people won't use the word illegal, that we've had young people in our programs come in and use the word illegal, not because they mean to hurt someone, but because that's sort of how internalized the oppression is. What I mean to say by that is that the process of calling out oppression in our spaces is extremely messy, and it absolutely requires compassion. I have never seen someone actually improve and grow and stay in the space who was called out and yelled at and made to feel bad. I've never seen that happen. In fact, the people that I know have been have felt really bad and have sort of been shamed or shunned for what they thought or what they had said in youth organizing spaces are usually the people that end up leaving. And I think that's a problem. And I think that when we, as people who are deeply hurt by oppression, get to have spaces to heal from that oppression, when I say rage, I mean rage, Mariana, right? Like undocumented people, just as an example, have a lot of raging to do that we do not get to do. Once we get that space to do that, we can navigate the world so much more effectively. We can confront oppression in a way that's smart, in a way that actually moves minds and hearts. And I think that we have to also apply in our organization. So to the question about how do you get employers to implement this, we're building a project called Listening Works to support people in integrating effective healing and support strategies. And the one thing I'll say is that what it takes is not an employer. What it takes is someone that plays a key role in that organization who is willing and wanting to learn about effective strategies for healing and support, and who can bring those things back slowly and confidently. again, we think that things can be as simple as helping people establish listening partnerships, which is where two people partner up and agree to share time, agree to be vulnerable with each other, and agree to just help each other think about anything and everything that they're feeling that is happening in their lives. It can be as simple as that to as a little more technical and complex as establishing weekly or monthly support circles for whatever group of people it makes sense, on whatever topic it makes sense, led by someone who understands the power of giving people time to be listened to, that understands the importance of framing oppression and sort of framing to people that what they're feeling and experiencing is a result of oppression, and then encouraging and allowing a safe enough space for people to let their emotions, to trust people with their emotions and to process those emotions as fully as possible. So I know that there are people who are wanting to know about what does this actually look like concretely back in our organizations? And I would say that there are very simple strategies to a little sort of more complex strategies, but all of them have been so effective in our organization over the past 24 years. To us, it really is about how do we create spaces that people trust enough to let themselves show fully.
I want to respond to this very quickly, Mariana.
Great.
Sorry, what was that?
No, that's great. Go ahead.
I really think, especially if we're talking about nonprofit employers, I think that the only thing they respond to is funding structures. And I've seen people under the language of accountability to community actually become less accountable, but produce results that funders recognize as legitimate results. And so community is actually the end result of accountability politics in the funding world, is actually less accountability to the people that things are being done to or supposedly being done for. And the only time I've seen employers really shift behavior that would require that they have to stop and pay attention to the impact of their behavior is if they're somehow mandated to do it in some way, shape, or form, if they feel like they're going to be found out. I have sat through so many site visits where there's a whole manicuring of a particular experience for the funder, right? And I only wish we took as much care with the actual people in the community, right? To actually tend to those relationships. So the Whitman Institute, Thousand Currents, organizations like that are really pushing this model of relationship-based, trust-based funding, I think should be looked at more carefully. And folks should really pay attention to what it would actually accountability in relationships. To me, actually, that is like a great thing, to be responsible to and for the quality of how we engage, and to be transparent in our interactions with the very people that we're supposed to be there for. To have folks who what they bring to bear is some resources, but they also bring company, and they also bring connection, and they also bring problem solving. One of the best people I've ever worked with in the funding world is Winnie Hernandez Gallegos, who's I think still at Kresge, who was completely relational and completely open, but herself alone almost working against the grain of some of the organizations she's been in. I have the utmost respect for somebody like her, for P. Infante, for David Kerner, for Vinnie Bansali, who are people who are working to try to create that kind of way. And so community really is the way that you change things. It always comes back to community. If employers believe that they have to be part of a community that's going to actually begin to ask them questions about the quality of their relationships, they're going to change the game.
I'd like to speak a little bit to this as well. We at Rockwood practice what we preach. So 32 hours is full time for us. And we have a number of practices, cultural practices here that are about all the things that we've been talking about today. And it's not hard, but it does take leadership. It requires that somebody say, we've got to do this, we're going to do this in a different way. And but it's a cultural issue as well. And I talk about it, I'll say that, put that in the nonprofit culture. As much as I beat my drum about everybody. This can't be just one person taking care of themselves or one organization shifting it up. It's going to require all of us to do this. As much as I'm talking about that, people will say, oh, Kaya, it's 32 hours a week. That's amazing. Can I come work for you? And I'm going, no, go take this out. We all should be working however many hours, but you know, this is something we have to do collectively. And every time almost people say, oh no, we could never do that in our organization. And I'm sitting there going, why not? I'm talking to EDs and presidents who are saying I could never do that. I'm going, well, why couldn't you? Here's how we do it. We even made a little how-to document so that it wasn't hard. And there's this huge resistance in, I think, our social movements and certainly in the nonprofit context to move toward a more human or full human way of doing organizational work. The resistance is astonishing. So it isn't about a single leader or a single organization. We've got to shift the culture around this.
Yeah, and I would add and say that, the quality of the invitation that we offer has to do with the quality of our personal practice and the way that then emanates into community. The best work I've done that I've seen actually lead to deep behavioral change has to do with folks choosing to go into something that's more compelling than what they already have. And so,
amen.
To offer the more compelling possibility, and then to make it doable. Thank you for having me, Mariana. I appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. So one final question. So yesterday, during the State of Our Union address that was sponsored by the National Domestic Workers Alliance, Tarana Burke, who's the founder of the Me Too movement and is also from Girls for Gender Equity, which is a SHOT grantee partner. She reminded us that we are also vessels of joy, and she even busted a move, which I'll do right now. And I'm just keeping that wave moving, Tarana, to ask this question. What role does joy play in movement building? And is this something that shows up, or do we need to do a better job engaging with it? If so, how?
I'd like to take this first piece. We have to have more joy in our movements. If we're going to continue, the young folks coming in and looking at a bunch of haggard, angry, bitter people who never take a vacation, didn't have families, all that. Well, how interesting is that? It isn't. So creating joy, opportunities for joy and dance and creativity, and remembering that we are more than the accumulations of our oppression, and that we can live and dance with great responsibility to the world in abundance and joy. It's essential. It's essential.
We at Youth on Board, the best organizing meeting spaces are spaces that are filled with food, that are filled with music, that are filled with plenty of space for people to joke around, get to know each other, laugh. That is movement building. It is about creating spaces that reimagine what the world could look like versus what the world currently looks like. And I also think we don't necessarily have to manufacture joy. I think that underneath the lack of joy is real hurt from oppression. And if we create spaces where people get to process those hurts, and we take it seriously, and we take people's emotions seriously, and we give them a space for them to process them, joy comes out of that. And then just wanted to sort of say about, how do you do this with, employers who may not be willing to? Of course, an employer that is determined to squash any of this is a different scenario. But in any situation where an employer sort of doesn't care, doesn't really want to do it, but isn't trying to stop anyone. You know, we've had a lot of success with helping organizations take this model on just because one staff member or one leader was interested in making it happen and was able to make it happen in their own way. They were able to establish support groups outside of work hours. They were able to establish listening partnerships between some of the staff and some of the leaders. And that in itself has lent this immigrant youth organization here in Boston just such a different way of being able to operate and think about things. And the ED didn't even have to be involved. It would be ideal, but I think there is hope. And I think there are ways that we can start to carve out some of these really important healing and support spaces that don't necessarily require the approval of the powers that be.
Having joy is an outcome of living in a general sense of well-being and abundance. And the outside world does not determine that for us.
So we are at time, y'all, and this has been an amazing conversation. I just want to say y'all's phones are going to blow up now. I think folks are going to want to reach out and get more answers. There were certainly a lot of questions, and we want to thank the audience for staying engaged with us, making self-care, or whatever you want to call it, a priority in this work. And at least you made it a priority today. Certainly share the webinar. It's going to be made available afterwards. And then look forward to additional webinars and opportunities by going and subscribing to our newsletter at shotfoundation.org. You can also follow us on Twitter at ShotFound and like us on our Facebook page for more information. Thank you all once again. Really appreciated this conversation and having you all the day after. Bye, everyone.